I think it certainly is possible to do ethical marketing, but sometimes people have to learn more about how to do that and what to avoid.
Welcome to A History of Marketing. I'm Andrew Mittrack, and today I'm joined by Jean Kilbourne, an author, lecturer, filmmaker, and activist. Kilbourne is best known as a pioneer of feminist advertising criticism and for her documentary film series, Killing Us Softly. Killing Us Softly focuses on the portrayal of women in advertising, drawing attention to harmful stereotypes, the objectification of women's bodies, and the effects of advertising on women's self-image. Kilbourne has also criticized the alcohol and tobacco industries for advertisements targeted towards children. Now, when I've talked about advertising in prior episodes of this podcast, it's mostly been with a positive bias. I've talked with guests about the creative revolution, bringing science to advertising, and iconic ads like Apple's 1984, Volkswagen's Think Small, and Dove's Real Beauty campaign. But the advertising industry is not without its critics. And as a history podcast, it's important to cover the good, the bad, and the ugly. Also, as a professional marketer, I want to learn from critics of the advertising industry so I can avoid making the same mistakes others have made in the past. And there's no better guest for this conversation than Jean Kilbourne. Kilbourne has been a trailblazing advertising critic for more than 50 years. Her films raise important points, and they're also funny and entertaining. So this is an episode I'm very excited to share with you. Here it is, my conversation with Jean Kilbourne. Jean Kilbourne, welcome to A History of Marketing.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So I want to start back in the late 1960s or so, and when you began cutting out and saving those first advertisements. Can you take us back to that moment? Like, was there a specific ad that stood out to you, or what motivated you to first find advertisements, say, I need to preserve this?
I sometimes say in 1968, I saw an ad that changed my life, and I did. But I have to go back a little bit as to why I would have been interested in this ad. I was involved in the anti-war movement, like a lot of people in my generation, and then went from that to the second wave of the women's movement. So I was already interested in feminism and all of that. I went to Wellesley College, and then I had to go to secretarial school to get a job. So my options were very limited. I was a waitress, I was a secretary, etc. So I had a job putting ads into the Lancet, the British medical journal, the Lancet, simply placing the ads into the magazine. And one of these ads was an ad for birth control pills called Ovulin 21. And it featured a smiling woman's head, and it said Ovulin 21. It helps you remember by weekdays rather than cycle days. And in the woman's head were 7 boxes, one for each day of the week. So Monday was a laundry basket, Tuesday was an iron. And the gist of the ad was that women were too stupid to remember our cycle days, but we could remember the days of the week. And I remember looking at this, and it wasn't the first ad I've ever seen that, trivialized women or stereotyped women, but there was something so atrocious about this particular ad. And I remember thinking, this is really awful, and it's not trivial. That this is going into a medical journal. It's not trivial. So that was the first ad I took home, and I put it on my refrigerator with a magnet. And then I started noticing and collecting other ads.
So you put it on your refrigerator to collect it. You didn't have a vision at the start of turning these into slide presentations. It was just to kind of preserve the evidence of this crime.
That's exactly right. And of course, there wasn't even a model for doing a slide presentation on this. It wasn't. Sometimes people say, did you set out to do this? There wasn't anybody who was sort of traveling around with slide presentations, or at least not on this topic, certainly. So, but I did become interested enough, and I began to see patterns in the ads. I had maybe 10 or 15 ads on the refrigerator by then, and I began to think, these are related in some way, and they really are saying something about what it means to be a woman in this culture in terms of advertising and the mass media. So then I had a camera, but I got a macro lens, I got a copy stand. This was, over 50 years ago. So it was really a time when, that's what you had to do. I had to teach myself how to do all that. And I turned the ads into slides. But even then, I didn't think this was something I was going to make a career out of. I was just very interested. And then I became a teacher. I was a high school teacher for about 3 years, and I began to use the slides in my classes.
In your classes, yeah. So what were the other ads? What were sort of the assortment that you had? What was the range of ads that you were
So
collecting?
some of them were just the ideal image of beauty that was everywhere and was so much the same. Some of them I noticed that women's bodies were dismembered in advertising. So that many ads featured obviously women's breasts, the huge way to sell products, but also a woman's torso or women's legs. And this was not happening to men. So I noticed that. And that seemed to be saying something about the dehumanization of women and the objectification of women. There were also quite a few ads that were uh, violent in one way or another that seemed to portray battering or rape in a kind of jokey sort of way, usually. But I noticed those too, and those, of course, stood out for me. So there were many different patterns that I saw.
Yeah. When you use the word dismembered, it's a really violent word. Sometimes though, it's also sort of tightly cropped and sort of where the camera frames on, and it's showing a piece or a portion of someone's body versus sort of the entire human. Is that sort of the idea behind that?
Well, sometimes, but sometimes it's literally the ad would simply feature a woman's legs, or a woman's legs sort of in the air, or sometimes often it would feature just a woman's breasts. So it wasn't that just the way it was framed, it's just sort of the way it was shot. Um, so that seemed to me particularly dehumanizing. I mean, I use the word dismemberment uh,
Yeah.
on purpose because the body really was dismembered. And again, this wasn't something that was done to men. Also, there were many ads that featured women without heads, basically. I mean, not that they're, so the ad would start, from the neck down. And that seemed sort of something that was not happening to men either. And that seemed to be very dehumanizing and objectifying.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I noticed was the body language of women, that it was often so trivializing. And often, one of the things that I talked about in the original version of Killing Us Softly and still do was the sexualization of little girls. And that was happening even then. So little girls were presented in sexualized ways, and adult women were infantilized. So adult women would be portrayed dressed like a little girl or with a lollipop or a headband or something like that. So that was something that stood out too when I started collecting Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. And so the initial collection, you first presented these in a high school class. What was sort of the context for the initial presentation?
Well, I taught high school in the late 1960s, so I got away with a whole lot. I was able to sort of teach whatever I wanted to teach. I was an English teacher, but I created a film study class, and then I created a women's study. I mean, I did things that would be impossible to do today. We were not teaching to the test, to put it mildly. Um, and so I think I used this, in a unit I was doing on probably on women's issues, but also maybe on media. And and so I did use it in the beginning. I used the slides in my high school class, right?
Yeah.
And the
So
and they were incredibly effective in terms of, teaching the students not only about, issues about women, but also about advertising and about marketing. So
yeah. So one of the themes of your work is that the advertising industry's goal isn't just to sell an individual product, but to sell a perpetual state of dissatisfaction. That they're not just selling lipstick, but they're selling the need for lipstick. And was there a moment or a specific ad that shifted your understanding about sort of the overall goals of advertising, or when did this kind of bigger picture come into play?
there wasn't a particular ad, but I did notice that, um, most of the products that were being sold were really the same, so that was one thing that, the kind of lipstick or the, moisturizer or whatever. In fact, I would go sometimes to, a CVS or a drugstore and look at the brand name items versus what was being sold, cheaply, and the ingredients were almost always the same. And so that made me realize that what they had to be selling was an image. They had to be selling something beyond, the lipstick and the moisturizer. So that was one thing. Another thing that became clear quite quickly is that many of the products that were being sold to women didn't really work. the so-called anti-aging products, for example, which were almost always featured a very young woman, and
Mhm.
spearing on this cream. And also the diet products. I mean, that they, of course, did not work because if they did, then that would be that. Of course, the world has changed since then, and now there are, diet products that do work, and not so much that there are anti-aging products that work, but people have surgery and all kinds of other ways to do that. But 50, 60 years ago, that wasn't the case. So these products seem to be not only the same, but they actually weren't working. So all the more reason that they had to be sold by selling something other than the product. And I'd also been influenced by there wasn't much out there about advertising in those days, but I had read Vance Packard's book, The Hidden
Mhm.
Persuaders, in high school, and I remember being fascinated by that. And I also had read Irving Goffman's book on gender advertisements, which was also that was mostly about the body language and the way in which women are posed and everything. And that was very important to me as well. So those things informed my consciousness about all this.
Yeah. Is Irving Goffman, do you kind of write about also sort of the masks that we wear or that there's sort of different personas? Am I remembering the right author?
Yeah, he's a sociologist who wrote about a lot of things, but I think only that one book was about gender, and it was very specifically uh, about again, not just body language, but things that still are true. The way in which women often um, are cover their mouths in ads, or or do the little girl thing, become sort of ridiculous or trivialized. So he pointed that out early on.
Yeah. So you're sort of drawing from some of these sociologists like Goffman, others who have written about advertising. And then you were doing a lot of your own research, literally through magazines and just what you were finding and kind of piecing
Right.
piecing this together just through your independent research.
And I had a feminist point of view, of course, which, did Vance Packard did not,
Right.
and so that made it different as well.
From your feminist point of view, what were your key inspirations there? Who was sort of inspiring you and what literature were you reading?
Well, that's kind of interesting because, nobody was talking about advertising or the image of women in advertising, I mean, at all. And in fact, most feminists in those days felt that it was a trivial issue. Everybody thought it was a trivial issue. So, what I heard most of all people would say is, "I don't pay attention to ads, I just tune them out." So everyone believes that they're somehow, not susceptible to advertising, which of course makes the advertiser's job so much easier because, we're not it's beneath our radar. But what feminists would say to me was, "We don't have time to deal with trivial issues like the image of women in advertising. We're dealing with serious issues like violence against women." And I would say it's related. When you objectify women, you set them up for violence. I mean, that in fact, it's a necessary step for violence is to dehumanize the person. You're being violent too. I don't think it's really possible to be violent to someone you consider an equal human being, but it's very easy to abuse a thing. So that was my argument, but it took years before even feminists took the issue seriously. So when I started, I don't think there was anybody else who was really looking at this in any kind of serious way. In terms of the other influence, I mean, I was influenced by um, certainly by some of the books at the time, but more I was influenced by the consciousness raising groups because that was the second wave of feminism really um, came about, or the main way thing that we did was we got together in small groups and told the truth about our lives. And the poet Muriel Rukeyser has a wonderful line: "What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open." And that is what happened in these consciousness raising groups, that we realized we were not alone. That those of us who've been raped, those of us who've been sexually harassed, those of us who've been, in abusive relationships, we were not alone. And up until that time, I've been sexually harassed sort of all the time, and I thought it was something I was doing, wrong, or that I was the only one. So just to learn that this was happening and it was happening in a very systemic way was incredibly important.
Yeah. You recognize that this is happening this systemic way. Part of this podcast is sort of taking a historical view on marketing and advertising. And do you have a sense of when this emerged, whether it's unrealistic beauty standards or harmful stereotypes of women sort of started to appear in advertising? Was it there from the beginning, or were there moments that sort of punctuated it becoming more of a prominent part of
You know,
advertising?
you probably know more about this than I do, but in the beginning, I think of advertising was designed to give information, right? It was sort of something in the newspaper telling people where to go for a sale or something, or in the very beginning, signs on buildings. Here's a tailor, here's a that sort of thing, and that then it became something that was very, very different, and it became something that again was selling products that often people did not need, or selling them using sort of images that were harmful and destructive in some way. I used to say to my audiences sometimes that if an ad is giving honest information about a product that we need, I have absolutely no problem with that. But can you name an ad that does that? And, a national or international ad? And really, hardly ever could somebody really say, this is honest information about a product that we really need. So I think that was part of, what happened was that as as the whole media sort of changed with television and all of that, and became much more advertising based and commercially based, so that the point of the programs and the magazines and everything was to sell audiences to advertisers. That was when things really flipped and became very, very different than they'd been in the past.
One that you've spoken about also, it's sort of a historical one, is De Beers, and sort of the idea that a diamond is forever, and that we didn't feel the need to sort of purchase things like engagement rings, but this company sort of through creating this need or creating the dissatisfaction of somehow your love of somebody is measured by the size of a ring. That's one that it strikes me as a kind of a historical example. I think it was in the 40s or so that one appeared.
Absolutely, yeah, and I don't think diamonds were even particularly precious or desirable really at that before then. Then and that's such a good example of how a company created sort of a need. One of the earliest examples too, that I use a lot is comes from Edward Bernays, of course, who was the father of public relations, and he had the brilliant idea in, I think it was 1929, to march with the suffragists. He hired women to march with the suffragists in the Easter parade, I think, and then to light cigarettes. And when that was a sort of an amazing thing to do then for women to smoke in public. And when they were asked about it, they would say, these are torches of freedom. And so what he did was he linked smoking with liberation for women. And then, of course, that went on. We saw that with Virginia Slims, you've come a long way, baby. It was a direct line from that. But what an amazing thing to link, addiction, an addictive product in this way with liberation for women, with freedom. So he was one of
Yeah.
the starters of that sort of thing.
That's right. Yeah, I recorded an episode with a Bernays biographer. We talked about this, and it's sort of co-opting a movement for good with commercialization. In this case, commercialization of a lethal product that's killing its
Right.
customers.
Well, actually, I did my doctoral thesis on the co-optation of um, women, the liberation um, by the media, by advertising, and I've always felt that um, capitalism always co-ops any kind of radical movement for change. Whether it's women's liberation or the green movement or basically anything that's going to um, bring about radical change in the society that might harm profit, that shareholders' profit, is going to be co-opted. And we're seeing more and more of that now.
One piece of your own history that we haven't talked about yet is that you were once a model in London in the 1960s, and you've spoken about how this is a formative experience for you. Do you have any reflections of this time? And did your later study and analysis of advertising sort of change your own memories and your own sort of reflections of it as well?
I didn't really set out to be a model, but I was again, as I said, I went to Wellesley College and then I went to secretarial school. So the options for women were so limited, and I was a waitress and I was a secretary, but modeling was one of the few jobs available to women that was lucrative. And and I was often, when I was young, obviously this only happens when you're young, I was encouraged to enter beauty contests and to model. And I was always ambivalent about it, always, because um, for one thing, it seemed sort of awful to rely so much on something like one's looks, one's image. But again, it was lucrative, and also in those days, there was a lot of encouragement to do it. I mean, nobody saw anything wrong with it. It was like, wow, you have this opportunity, you should do it. But I found it incredibly depressing, actually, and dehumanizing. I also found it interesting that the other models, the ones who were really doing this, they were among the most insecure group of women I've ever known. Because if your value depends on your looks, I mean, you're always going to be comparing yourself to somebody else, or dreading growing older. And of course, in those days, growing older meant turning 30. So I would do it and then I would back away from it. The other thing about it is there was an incredible amount of sexual harassment, and that just sort of came with the territory. And the amount of number of times that I was told I could really make it big if only. So that that was very depressing as well. So it was not a career by a long shot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry that you went through that. It's disgusting and makes you angry and sad. And also just that so many it's a profession that so many young people aspire to. It's glamorized in a way, and that really it's a career that even even the very small number who are successful within it seem, as you're mentioning, have deep insecurities or other, face other challenges.
Yeah, thank you. It's also changed tremendously because when I was young, models were not famous. You did not know the names of if you knew and maybe you knew Jean Shrimpton, I mean, but you really didn't know the names of the models. They weren't celebrities. And then of course that changed and the models became supermodels and then they became very famous. And also, when I was young, we didn't really expect to look like the models. I mean, we didn't think we were actually going to be able to, we didn't measure ourselves against them all the time, the way that certainly is happening now. So it was a very different world.
Jumping around a little bit, you had been putting these slides together for your high school courses. Do you remember the first time you gave what became the "Killing Us Softly" lecture? What was sort of the audience, and what was the initial response to it?
Well, I remember the first time I gave it to a large audience, because I did it in classrooms, then I got invited to do it, for smaller groups and, various here and there. But the first large audience was at Concord Academy in Massachusetts, a group of, a very progressive, wonderful school. And I was invited to speak to the entire student body, which would, I think, have been about 400 or 500 people. And I was so terrified that when I was driving there, I seriously considered driving off the road, not to kill myself, but just to be incapacitated. The other thing I thought about was phoning in a bomb scare, which in those days did not land you in federal prison, but it would have, I was terrified because one thing that I think people are often surprised to hear is that I was very afraid of public speaking. Most Americans are. In fact, studies say that we fear speaking more than death, which I've always found kind of funny. But that didn't mean I wasn't good at it. I was actually always pretty good at it, and I actually enjoyed it. But I was very afraid of it. So that first big audience was hugely important because had it not gone well, I'm not sure what would have happened, but it went very, very well. And I got a standing ovation and they had wonderful questions and they, you know, stayed around to talk for a long time. So it was very, very heartening. So I remember that lecture very, very well. And
Yeah.
another thing, in terms of the very first lectures I gave, I think one of the things that you had asked me about was what was the response, of an audience in the beginning? And I think what surprised me the most when I first started doing this was that people laughed. I hadn't sort of set out to be funny, and I also never wrote out a script. Everything I did was sort of ad lib. So I remember the first time that I said, talking about the ideal image, that she is completely flawless. She has no scars or blemishes. Indeed, she has no pores, and everybody laughed. And I thought, wow, that's fun. So I keep using that line. And
Mhm.
and I then started encouraging people to laugh at the ads because I thought it was good to ridicule the ads. And so then the presentation became actually very funny because the ads are so ridiculous. And I think that had a lot to do with the success of Killing Us Softly, that it was funny, and it was not what people were expecting. They were expecting, I don't know, a polemic or some sort of, I don't know what, but it was not what they were expecting.
It is, it is actually funny. And it is the thing is, it's also entertaining to watch. It doesn't feel like homework. It's sort of there's eating your vegetables, but also having some sugar with it or something, where it just makes it go down a little easier. And then
Yeah.
also,
Some of my best lines, by the way, came from my audiences, and one of my favorite was an ad, this was a long time ago, for a diet product, and it said, "I'd probably never be married now if I hadn't lost 49 pounds." And one woman shouted out that that was the best advertisement for fat she'd ever seen. And the audience broke up, and I started using that line all the time too. And the other thing is, in those days when I was starting out, it's so tired, but people were saying feminists had no sense of humor. That was a big thing. That, I mean, we were ugly, and we were, depressing, and we were man haters and all of that, but we had no sense of humor. So I certainly wanted to dispel that.
yeah, that's great. Um, Now, when it sounds like these were popular lectures, as soon as you started getting these big audiences, and you traveled the country, right? You traveled to different colleges. I read online. I can't believe everything I read on the internet, but it looks like you were one of the most popular lecturers of the 1970s visiting colleges.
Well well, there was one at one point somewhere in the maybe in the early '80s, that the New York Times Magazine said somewhere that I was one of the 3 most popular lecturers on college campuses, one of whom was Maya Angelou, so I was very, pleased by that. We actually had the same agent, so but, I was, in the very beginning, I was doing maybe 110 lectures a year. I was going out on Monday and coming back on Friday, different place every single night. I think I've lectured at close to half of all the colleges in the US, and most of the ones in Canada. I also traveled a lot in Canada. So that was it. I've been on at least 1,500, campuses. So I was out just on the road all the time. And I was young, so it was exciting, and it was exciting to see audiences' reactions all across the country. I've lectured in every state, every province. So then I had a child fairly late in life and cut back, but I still was doing like 70 a year, but not, I didn't want to be away from home more than about 2 nights a week. So that's how I managed that.
Yeah. Is this partly what inspired you to turn your lecture into a film? Just that this travel schedule was so intense, and there's clearly such demand to see your lecture, that is this what sort of inspired the film version of Killing Us Softly?
Well, that would make sense. But that's not what happened. What happened, because I didn't have, in those days, how shall I put it? I didn't have very high self-esteem, and it never would have occurred to me that people would have wanted to turn my lecture into a film. I mean, that just wouldn't have crossed my mind. So 2 filmmakers approached me and said that they wanted to turn it into a film. And I think my reaction was, "Oh my, I mean, these nice filmmakers think that my work is important." I mean, looking back, this is kind of crazy, but anyway, that's the way it was. Not just for me, for a lot of women. So the film was made, and the film was, it was a one take, one camera film, cost $6,000 to make, and it, in today's terms, went viral, and, made a lot of money, and also really was seen by a whole lot of people. Unfortunately, I had made a very bad deal with those filmmakers, so, eventually, I switched over to the Media Education Foundation and have made my films with them ever since, and that's been much better for me and for everybody.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of how did it go viral? Where were people actually watching it? Was it
Oh, no.
where was it being played?
I have no idea, except word of mouth from, as it was shown in classrooms, and I think in particular feminists who were teaching found this an incredibly effective way to teach their students about sexism and about all of this without, in an entertaining way, in a way that would capture their attention. And so I think it just had to be word of mouth, people at conferences, people at different, and of course, the fact that I was on the road, I mean, I was spreading the word that way. But when I think about it, I mean, I could be on the road for 100 years and I wouldn't reach nearly the audience that, Killing Us Softly has been able to reach. So it just It just happened, word of mouth. Because in those days,
Yeah.
there was no social media, there really wasn't, and there really wasn't any advertising for the film.
Did this change your career at all? This film going viral?
It changed my career a lot, and in 2 ways. I mean, one is that, or not so much my career, but in terms of what I was trying to do, because I've always been, I mean, I'm an advocate, right? I'm an activist, that's really what this is about, and so it was I was able to get the message out to so many more people than no matter how many lectures I did. But the other thing, of course, is that the more people saw the film, the more they wanted to see me in person. So then I became, more popular as a lecturer and more in demand as a lecturer. So
Did you have
yeah,
to come up with new material, because people had already seen the film? Did you feel some pressure, almost like a stand-up comedian to once their special's out, they usually come up with new material. Did you have to, sort of think, "Oh, well, if they've already seen the film, I need to have new ads or new material, beyond
in
their."
theory, the
Yeah.
the trouble is, as you know, the ads turn over so fast,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there was no way I was gonna really be able to keep up. And
Mhm.
also, some of the ads that I were so perfect and making my point that I didn't wanna stop using them.
Yeah.
But what I would do is I would find new ads and I would sprinkle them in, but I didn't totally change the presentation. And then eventually, by the time I got to Killing Us Softly 3, Killing Us Softly 4, I began to present it more as an historical perspective. I mean, here's what it was like, and here's what it's like now. So that way I was able to
Yeah.
use a lot of the same material, but have it updated enough to keep people's interest.
Yeah.
There are teachers who, have probably seen Killing Us Softly hundreds of times. I mean, almost hate to they could sing along with me at any presentation, and they seem not to mind, which was very touching, often anyway, yeah.
Yeah. We haven't talked about the advertising industry's response to your work yet. What was their initial reaction to it?
The initial reaction was to just ignore it, of course, and then sometimes they attacked it, but not so much when I was talking about the image of women. It was when I started talking and making films about alcohol advertising and tobacco advertising. That's when they became upset. And that's when they started labeling me a prohibitionist. They called me Carrie Nation, that kind of thing. They tried to turn my message into something that it wasn't at all. Because I mean, the image of women, I mean, sort of by that time, sort of everybody knew it was a problem, but it there wasn't it was gonna be hard for them to sort of fight back against that, but they could fight back against, what I was saying about alcohol and tobacco. And I think also what I was saying about alcohol and tobacco, because I started doing research and talking about those issues in the '70s as well, that I was presenting something very different, than had been presented before. For example, with smoking, the typical approach for with kids was to show them diseased lungs and things like that. I started smoking when I was 13. I wouldn't have cared about a diseased lung at all, really. I mean, I didn't expect to live beyond 50. Well, who would want to, right? So, uh, but what would have gotten my attention was being told that I was being manipulated by a very powerful industry that wanted my money, and that is what I did. I started talking about the ways in which these industries were targeting kids and the messages that they were using, not at all about what the health consequences were, because again, most kids feel they're immortal and they really don't care, about the health consequences, but they really don't want to be manipulated. So that was my great insight on those. And since then, I mean, that's become the primary sort of prevention tool, working with alcohol and tobacco, but it really wasn't then in the '70s.
In one of your articles, you wrote, "It is virtually impossible to measure the influence of advertising on a culture." End quote. And I'm wondering if there have been attempts to establish a direct causal relationship between advertising and some of the negative effects we've been talking about. Because it does like strike me that there's a lot of correlations, right? But is there have there been any research? Has there been any research that you found compelling that really tries to kind of show the exact like direct cause between these two, or to quantify the negative impact? Because it is clearly very tough to do, but I'm just wondering if you've been closer to this than anybody. Have you seen any kind of direct causal aside?
People have tried. I mean, people have done studies of the influence of Killing Us Softly on people, on
Yeah.
audiences. And I mean, sometimes they found that there's a slight positive influence, but again, who knows really? I think the fact that there really aren't control groups. It's almost impossible to do the kind of gold standard research. Makes it very, very difficult. And some of it has been just ridiculous. Like I remember doing an interview with somebody about a TV person about alcohol advertising and about the effect that alcohol advertising has on, on us and on young people in particular. And then the rebuttal to that was the reporter went into a bar and asked the people at the bar if they were drinking because of alcohol advertising. How many people said yes, do you think? None. Obvious. I mean, it was so stupid, but that was sort of the kind of approach, or it has been the approach because it actually is very difficult to find. I mean, I think advertisers would love to know, right?
Great. No, it's what's kind of ironic about, I guess, what part of the setup of the question is that advertisers want to know the impacts of their ads to be able to show to, whether you're an in-house marketing team and you're kind of showing to your boss and your finance team that yes, advertising is positive ROI. Advertising agencies, they want to show that their ads work, but also that in the same way that you'd like to show, hey, and I'd also like to directly measure the harm of this, but for different kind of end of reasons of what the harm is or whether it actually works. It's tough to show the causality, even though you both would want to in some way.
I think it's very tough, right? I mean, as you say, when advertisers try to see if this particular ad is effective, that's hard, right? It's hard for them to really measure that. At least it always has been. So maybe there's some new technology now, but I'm not aware of it.
Full disclosure, I am a marketing professional. I primarily work in B2B software marketing. So I don't think that it's the kinds of things that you mostly, I don't think you show much B2B software in your slides. But I think just as somebody who is, whether also I know a lot of students and other professors and educators listen to this show, just reflecting on folks who are marketing practitioners, what are some of the top lessons they can take away to help pursue their work in a responsible way? Do you have any thoughts on something that heck, I could take into my day job and try to be just mindful, responsible within a marketing and promotional industry?
One of the things that's really impressed me is how many advertisers, marketers have asked me that question, and students, who are studying advertising. Although I do remember one young woman who approached me and said, I saw your film last year and I switched my major from advertising to social work. And I said, I'm really sorry about the pay cut, but
Mhm.
but good for you. But I'm obviously not trying to have people do that. But what I do ask them to do is to think about some of the ethical issues that will come up, to think about those issues before they have mortgages, before they are in a situation where they feel like they have to do, if somebody comes along and says, we're marketing a cigarette to women by playing on their, fear of gaining weight, be in a position where you can say, I won't do that, as opposed to feeling like you have to. So, and that's one reason I think that there should be much more discussion about ethics and in business schools and in classes that are talking about this, because I think it certainly is possible to do ethical marketing, but sometimes people have to learn more about how to do that and what to avoid. So that's one thing that I suggest. I also suggest to people that they form alliances with, if they're, say, in an agency or something, form alliances with other people who care about these issues and want to market in a more responsible way. And one organization I love, and I think it may have started like 10 years ago, even longer, is called the 3% Solution. And um, Kat Gordon, the woman who started that, it started because at that time, 3% of creative directors in agencies were female. 3%. So now I think it's soared to like 11%. But in any event, most of the power was in the hands of, of men. And so what Kat did was she started this organization. And I remember I spoke at the first conference, and it was quite a while ago, and it's really taken off, of trying to get women and men who care about these issues to get together because there's strength in numbers. You might not want to be alone in opposing a marketing idea, but if you have people behind you, that can make a very big difference. So those are some of the things that I've suggested. I also, of course, suggest that people work for nonprofits, but but
Mhm.
again, sorry about the pay cut. But I do suggest that people use their skills because there are some incredible skills that are involved in this. Use them insofar as possible in a way that helps and does not harm.
I think it's useful for folks who do work in this industry. Hey, somebody's probably going to do this. I think you want folks who are educated and mindful about this to be there, because otherwise, it's if they all leave and all go to nonprofits, it's just the folks who don't care at all
Yeah.
continue working in the for-profit sector.
But people could do it in the for-profit sector and maybe do pro bono work, which a lot of people do, right? For the nonprofit,
Yeah,
because like God knows the nonprofit sector needs those skills. I mean, needs good marketing and good advertising. It's really important.
absolutely. Yeah. One thing also is what strikes me as I was watching, Killing Us Softly, researching this, is that everything that's being discussed, I never learned as a marketer, right? It's like I've read a lot of advertising books and marketing books, and nobody ever told me, and here's how you Photoshop somebody to look unnaturally skinny and perfect, and here's how you manipulate people, and here's how you lean into create this sense of desire and unfulfilled needs. You don't learn that. You learn things like how is your product positioned, and what is your segment and target audience, and where do you think these underlying things sort of come from? Is it just sort of an unspoken pressure that the industry has to Photoshop people in strange ways? Where are these ideas coming from? Because they're not in marketing textbooks or advertising books, and they don't speak about it publicly in conferences, but like it does happen, and it does kind of come out in the open. Where do you think it originates?
That's an excellent question. I really don't know, because you're absolutely right. It's not in textbooks. It's not in conferences. So, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think that it's taking place in dark rooms somewhere. Well, it is taking place in dark rooms. But never mind. But that it's. I mean, it must be in photography studios and advertising. I mean, there must be, because obviously people are doing this. They're doing it all the time, and so somebody's teaching them. They're learning somewhere. What do you think?
Yeah, I think a hypothesis I have is that if I just look at artwork in general, like I remember seeing Michelangelo's David in Florence, right?
Mhm.
And perfect body. I don't have that body, right? This sculpture, it's more than 500 years old now or something, right? That's
Mhm.
so somewhere along that, and that there is a lot of artwork shows ideal forms of people, and that also, when I got into film kind of early, before becoming a marketer. I was doing filmmaking, and when I learned to color correct people, like, oh, the lighting's off, let me sort of adjust that, and you kind of give people a tan a little bit with your color grading, and I don't think I was intentionally trying to say, oh, tan skin is beautiful, but there's sort of we're primed this way through artwork, through advertising, through all sorts of media we consume, of like what looks good, and we do that, and that people maybe even not consciously just kind of have an intuition around what are good aesthetics, and that in some ads, it might be sort of an unconscious bias somebody has to just create beauty, or fix what they see as some blemish or some flaw, and it might not even be as conscious that people do it, and the work you're doing is actually showing unconscious biases that have kind of compounded to create these distorted aesthetics that we see in advertisements so far. That's, again, I'm not an expert at this at all, and that's just kind of a hypothesis or a musing that I had
I
about.
think that's part of when you mentioned the statue of David. I mean, an ideal image of beauty has existed forever, probably, right?
Right.
Um, the difference between seeing a statue of David and being hit with an ideal image, you know, thousands of times a day, everywhere through all kinds of that to me is a very, very different thing from appreciating the beauty of a figure in an artwork versus seeing not only seeing it everywhere, but seeing no other no other options. I mean, it's not, you know, almost always for women and even for men, the models are very, very specific. So that's one thing. The other thing is what a difference when I think about things like every time I go to the museum and I see, Rubens, for example, and I see the women, I think, how would this change women's lives, if this were the ideal? I mean,
Yeah.
I think it would change women's lives dramatically. And so that that says something about the power of the image. And in terms of people doing this unconsciously, I think you're right. I think that sometimes does happen. But I also think if they're selling a diet product, they're going to try and make do whatever they can to make the person look as thin as possible, including
Yeah.
ridiculous things like, the thinness becomes so incredible and so extreme that it's absolutely impossible, really. I mean, the first thing is a skeleton.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And I recall some of the images in your lecture series, and I think you also even used an example of there's a model, I think from South America, where she, died at like 88 pounds from
Right.
anorexia, and probably felt tremendous pressure. And so really, some very awful, killing us softly, some negative consequences from
Right. Yeah.
that as well. So
Yeah, a lot of anorexia, a lot of eating disorders, and and not, I mean, not all the models, obviously. I mean, but the
yeah,
models all have most of them have a certain type of body. Very tall, very thin, usually not very full breasted. So that's either done through Photoshop or implants, etc. But it is a very specific body, but a type, but it's a body type that, and I always say there's nothing wrong with this body type at all, but it's a body type that basically 5% of American women have. So if that's all you see, then
yeah,
you begin to feel, and you can't diet yourself into this body type. You just can't. It's, you
right.
most women are more apple shaped than than V shaped,
Well, Jean Kilbourne, thanks so much for this conversation, and for your work, and for sharing your insights and wisdom and reflections with us. This has been great. For folks who have enjoyed this conversation and want to learn more about your work, where would you direct them?
Well, I think probably to my website, if that isn't too old-fashioned. But, uh, anyway, because that's where people can find out about my films and my books. I have a couple of books and many articles, and I also have a resource list where people can get further information, and it's a resource list where I talk, there's parenting resources and media literacy and all kinds of different kinds of resources. So I mean, I'm on some I'm on LinkedIn and stuff, but but probably going to the website is the best way.
Well, yeah, I'll paste a link to that in the show notes and the blog that accompanies this post. So,
Thank
Jean
you.
Kilbourne, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too, and thanks for such great questions.
A History of Marketing is researched and edited by me, Andrew Mitrak. If you'd like new episodes delivered right to your inbox, visit marketinghistory.org. There you can also find transcripts of every conversation, including helpful links, images, videos, and other blogs about marketing history. You can send me an email at hello@marketinghistory.org. This podcast is a passion project of mine, and I have zero interest in monetizing it. But if you'd like to support A History of Marketing, consider leaving a review on your favorite podcasting app. Or better yet, tell a friend about the show. Thanks for listening.